the Montana sun cast long shadows across the valley as Eleanor Sullivan stood on the porch of her family's modest homestead. At 23, she had grown accustomed to the weight of responsibility that had fallen upon her shoulders since her mother's passing 3 years prior. The ranch had never been prosperous, but they had managed to survive through drought and harsh winters, her calloused hands testament to years of unrelenting labor. Her honey-blonde hair was pulled back in a practical braid, her blue eyes scanning the horizon for signs of her brothers returning from town. Something had been different about them lately. Hushed conversations that ceased when she entered the room, furtive glances exchanged over dinner. Eleanor could sense a storm brewing, one far more concerning than the dark clouds gathering over the distant mountains. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention. Thomas and Robert Sullivan rode side by side, their expressions unreadable as they dismounted in the yard. Eleanor noticed they wore their good shirts, unusual for a simple trip into White Ridge for supplies. "You're back early," she called out, wiping her hands on her apron. "Did you get the flour and coffee?" Thomas, the elder at 32, avoided her gaze as he secured his horse. Robert, younger by 3 years but equally burdened by the ranch's mounting debts, mumbled something about having business to discuss. The knot in Eleanor's stomach tightened. Whatever this business was, it involved her. She was certain of it. She followed them into the house, where Robert poured himself a generous glass of whiskey, despite the early hour. "Eleanor," Thomas finally spoke, his voice unnaturally formal. "Mr. Harrington will be joining us for dinner tonight. I'd like to kindly ask you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'm curious, what city are you watching from today?" Eleanor froze, her hand gripping the back of a chair. Maxwell Harrington was White Ridge's most powerful man, owner of the bank, the mercantile, the hotel, and half the properties in town. A widower in his 40s, his name was spoken with a mixture of respect and fear throughout the county. "Mr. Harrington? Here? Why would he?" she began, but Robert cut her off. "He's taken an interest in you, Ellie. Been watching you in town these past months." Thomas cleared his throat uncomfortably. "He's made an offer. A proposition that would benefit all of us." Eleanor's blood ran cold as understanding dawned. "What kind of proposition?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though she already knew the answer. Thomas stared at the floor as he spoke. "Marriage. He's offered to clear all our debts and provide capital for expanding the ranch. In exchange, you become Mrs. Harrington." The room seemed to spin around Eleanor as rage and disbelief flooded through her. "You've sold me?" she whispered, then louder. "You've sold me like one of our cattle?" Robert slammed his glass down. "Don't be dramatic, Ellie. It's a good match, the best you could hope for. You'll have fine clothes, a mansion in town, no more scrubbing and toiling until your hands bleed." Eleanor's eyes flashed dangerously. "How dare you? How dare you make this decision without me? I'm not a cow to be traded." Thomas stepped forward, his expression hardening. "The decision is made, Eleanor. The bank's foreclosing next week unless we agree. The ranch, everything Father built, gone. Harrington's offer solves everything." His voice softened slightly. "He's not a cruel man. He'll treat you well." Eleanor backed away from her brothers, these strangers who wore familiar faces. "And if I refuse?" Robert's laugh was bitter. "Then we lose everything. Is that what you want? To destroy this family out of stubbornness?" Eleanor felt trapped, cornered like an animal. Her brothers had always protected her, or so she had believed. Now they were her jailers, delivering her to a man 3 decades her senior, a man she had only seen from a distance, stern-faced and imposing as he moved through town like he owned it. Because he did. When? Was all she could manage to ask, her voice hollow. "Tonight," Thomas answered, unable to meet her gaze. "He'll be here at 6. Wear your Sunday dress." Eleanor climbed the stairs to her small bedroom in a daze, her world collapsing around her. Through the window, she could see the land stretching toward the mountains, the only home she had ever known. She could run, she thought wildly, saddle her mare and disappear into the wilderness. But where would she go? A woman alone had few options in this territory, and most were worse than becoming Mrs. Harrington. Eleanor sank onto her bed, hot tears streaming down her face as she realized the truth. Her brothers had already branded her with another man's name. Maxwell Harrington arrived precisely at 6, his polished carriage a stark contrast to the weathered buildings of the Sullivan Ranch. Eleanor watched from her window as he stepped down. Tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair and beard touched with silver at the temples. He wore an expensive suit and carried a small package wrapped in fine paper. Her stomach churned with anxiety and resentment as she smoothed her best dress, faded blue calico, woefully inadequate for receiving a suitor of Harrington's stature. Not that this was a proper courtship. This was a business transaction in which she was merely collateral. She had spent the afternoon alternating between tears of despair and plotting escape, ultimately reaching the conclusion that she had no choice but to meet this man and gauge for herself what kind of future awaited her. Perhaps if he proved truly unbearable, she would still flee. Consequences be damned. Dinner was an excruciating affair. Thomas and Robert spoke with forced joviality, praising the spring weather and the prospects for cattle prices, while Eleanor sat silently, pushing food around her plate. Maxwell Harrington observed her with keen gray eyes, addressing her directly several times, despite her monosyllabic responses. "Miss Sullivan?" he said eventually, his deep voice commanding attention. "Perhaps you and I might speak privately on the porch." It wasn't a request. Eleanor rose mechanically, ignoring her brother's encouraging nods as she led the way outside. The evening air was cool, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Harrington stood beside her at the railing, his presence overwhelming in the small space. "Your brothers tell me you're opposed to this arrangement," he said without preamble. Eleanor's head snapped up in surprise. She hadn't expected such directness, nor the acknowledgement of her resistance. "Wouldn't you be, Mr. Harrington?" she replied, finding her voice at last. "Being traded like livestock?" A faint smile touched his lips, though his eyes remained serious. "I would indeed, Miss Sullivan, which is why I've come to speak with you directly." He turned to face her fully. "I will be honest with you. I've observed you in town over these past months. Your dignity, despite your circumstances, your kindness to others, your intelligence when discussing books with Mrs. Fletcher at the lending library." Eleanor blinked in surprise. She hadn't realized anyone had noticed those quiet conversations about literature. "I am not seeking a decoration for my home or a silent companion. I am offering a partnership of sorts." He paused, studying her face. "Your brother's debts give me considerable leverage, it's true, but I would not force an unwilling woman to my side. The choice remains yours." Eleanor stared at him, searching for deceit in his expression and finding none. "What choice is it when my family will lose everything if I refuse?" she asked bitterly. Harrington nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words. A constrained choice, admittedly. But here is what I propose. Agree to a 3-month engagement. Come live in the guest quarters of my home, properly chaperoned by my housekeeper, Mrs. Collins. Use that time to decide if a life with me would be tolerable. I will clear your brother's immediate debts, regardless of your ultimate decision. Eleanor's breath caught. This was unexpected. A reprieve, if not a complete escape. And if, after 3 months, I still wish to refuse, he met her gaze steadily. Then you may do so, with my assurance that the initial debt forgiveness will stand. Your brothers will need to manage future finances more prudently, but they won't lose the ranch immediately. The package he had brought contained a book, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Mrs. Fletcher mentioned you hadn't had the opportunity to read it yet, he explained, handing it to Eleanor. She accepted it cautiously, wondering at this man who noticed such details, who spoke to her as though her thoughts mattered. He was not what she had expected. The monster of her imagination, an old lecher purchasing a young bride, was instead a perceptive man offering what flexibility he could within the constraints of the situation. 1 week, she said finally. Give me 1 week here to prepare myself and consider your offer. Maxwell nodded, seemingly pleased by her assertiveness. 1 week. I'll send a carriage next Friday. He hesitated, then added more softly. I do not expect love, Miss Sullivan, but I believe we might find mutual respect and perhaps, in time, companionship. I am not an unreasonable man. As he departed, Eleanor stood clutching the book, watching his carriage disappear into the darkness, her future equally shrouded in uncertainty. The week passed in a blur of preparations and tense conversations. Thomas and Robert alternated between gratitude that she had not immediately rejected Harrington and concern that she might still do so. He's being more than fair, Ellie, Thomas insisted as he helped her mend a tear in her second-best dress. Most men wouldn't offer such terms. Eleanor worked silently, her needle flashing in and out of the fabric. She had read Jane Eyre in 2 days, finding unsettling parallels in Rochester's position of power over the governess. Yet Rochester had truly loved Jane, while Harrington offered only respect and comfort. Would that be enough? Could she build a life on such a foundation? Each morning, she rose before dawn and rode her mare, Willow, across the ranch lands, memorizing every hill and stream, saying goodbye to the only home she had ever known. Each evening, she sat on the porch, watching the sunset, torn between resentment toward her brothers and a growing, grudging curiosity about the man who would be her husband. When Friday arrived, Eleanor was ready, not with enthusiasm, but with resignation tempered by determination. She would use these 3 months to establish herself as a woman of substance, not a purchased bride. The small trunk containing her meager possessions waited by the door. She wore her blue dress with a white collar she had added from one of her mother's old blouses, her hair neatly arranged beneath her bonnet. Thomas and Robert stood awkwardly in the yard as Harrington's carriage approached, driven by a young man Eleanor recognized as Peter, who sometimes worked at the livery stable. "We're doing this for the family, Ellie," Robert said, reaching for her hand. She pulled away. "No," she replied quietly. "You're doing this for yourselves. I'm doing this for the family." Thomas winced at her words, but didn't argue. The carriage stopped, and Peter jumped down to help with her trunk. Eleanor was surprised when he led Willow forward, saddled and ready. "Mr. Harrington thought you might prefer to ride alongside for part of the journey, miss," Peter explained with a smile. "Said you weren't one to be shut up in a carriage if you didn't want to be." The 5-mile journey to White Ridge gave Eleanor time to compose herself, the familiar rhythm of Willow's Gate beneath her providing comfort. The town appeared on the horizon, no longer just a place to sell cattle and purchase supplies, but her new home. As they approached Main Street, Eleanor became uncomfortably aware of the gazes following their progress. News traveled fast in small communities, and clearly, her arrangement with Harrington was common knowledge. She sat straighter in the saddle, refusing to show shame or uncertainty. Harrington's home stood on a hill overlooking the town, a large, two-story structure of red brick with white columns flanking the entrance. It was the grandest house in the county, surrounded by carefully tended gardens just coming into spring bloom. Eleanor's heart raced as they passed through the iron gates, the magnitude of the change in her circumstances suddenly overwhelming. Mrs. Collins, the housekeeper, met them at the door. A plump, gray-haired woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "Welcome, Miss Sullivan," she said warmly. "Mr. Harrington has been called to the bank on urgent business, but asked me to show you to your quarters and make you comfortable." She led Eleanor up a sweeping staircase to a suite of rooms on the east side of the house. A sitting room with tall windows overlooking the garden. A bedroom with a four-poster bed larger than any Eleanor had ever seen, and a private bathing room with running water. "Mr. Harrington had these rooms refurbished for you," Mrs. Collins explained, opening wardrobe doors to reveal several dresses. "He thought you might need some appropriate attire for town life." The seamstress used measurements from dresses of his late sister, who was of similar build to yourself. They can be altered as needed. Eleanor touched the fine fabrics, muslin, silk, wool of the highest quality, feeling increasingly disoriented. "This is too much," she whispered. Mrs. Collins smiled understandingly. "It's a significant change, to be sure. Mr. Harrington suggested you might appreciate time to settle in before joining him for dinner. He dines at 7. Left alone, Eleanor sank onto a velvet-upholstered chair, overwhelmed by luxury after a lifetime of frugality. The room was larger than the entire upper floor of her family's house. On a small writing desk sat a vase of fresh wildflowers and another book, Wuthering Heights. A note in a strong, slanting hand read, "I thought you might enjoy continuing your literary explorations. M.H." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. She moved to the window, gazing out at White Ridge spread below her. From this vantage point, she could see the bank, the mercantile, the hotel, all bearing the Harrington name. Properties that sustained the town's economy, providing employment and services. Properties that gave Maxwell Harrington his power. Properties that had allowed him to essentially purchase her from her brothers. Dinner that evening was a strained affair, despite Maxwell's efforts at pleasant conversation. Eleanor answered his questions politely, but briefly, hyper-aware of the fine china, crystal glasses, and silver cutlery that made her feel hopelessly out of place. "You're uncomfortable," he observed after the main course had been cleared. Eleanor met his gaze directly. "I don't belong here, Mr. Harrington. This isn't my world." He considered her words, swirling the wine in his glass. "Not yet, perhaps, but it could be in time." His directness was both disarming and refreshing. "Why me?" she asked suddenly. "You could have your pick of suitable women from wealthy families in Helena, or even back east. Why choose a penniless rancher's daughter?" Maxwell set down his glass, his expression thoughtful. "I married for social advantage once, Miss Sullivan. It was a cordial but empty union. Since Catherine's death 5 years ago, I've had ample time to consider what I truly value in a companion." "And what do you value, Mr. Harrington?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious despite herself. "Authenticity," he replied without hesitation. "Strength of character, intelligence. I've watched you manage your brothers' household with dignity despite difficult circumstances. I've seen your kindness to the Parker children when their mother was ill last winter. I've observed your thirst for knowledge despite limited access to education." He leaned forward slightly. "You may consider yourself purchased, Miss Sullivan, but I assure you, what interested me cannot be bought. It can only be freely given." Eleanor felt her cheeks flush under his steady gaze. There was something unsettling about being so carefully observed without her knowledge. Yet his assessment of her character seemed honest, even admiring. "You're very sure of your judgments, Mr. Harrington," she said carefully. A small smile touched his lips. "I've built my businesses on assessing character accurately, Miss Sullivan. I seldom make mistakes in that regard." Days stretched into weeks as Eleanor adjusted to life in the Harrington mansion. Each morning, she rode Willow across the expansive grounds, gradually extending her explorations to the surrounding countryside. Maxwell provided her with an allowance for personal necessities, he explained, which felt uncomfortably like payment, until Mrs. Collins gently pointed out that all ladies of standing maintained their own discretionary funds. Eleanor used the money to purchase books and to help the Parker family when young Samuel fell ill with fever. She discovered that while Harrington did indeed own half the town, he charged fair rents and had established a fund to assist families facing hardship. The man himself remained something of an enigma, courteous but reserved, joining her for dinner each evening and occasionally for breakfast, but otherwise occupied with his numerous business interests. They developed a routine of discussing books or local matters over their meals, conversations that Eleanor reluctantly found engaging. One morning in the Mercantile, Eleanor overheard two women whispering behind the fabric bolts. "Poor thing, sold by her brothers to clear their debts. Harrington could have taken any young lady, but he chose the Sullivan girl. Plain as porridge, though I suppose she's young and strong." The other woman tittered. "Well, men have their needs, especially widowers. He'll tire of her once the novelty wears off." Eleanor's face burned with humiliation as she clutched the paper pattern she'd been examining. She'd begun learning dressmaking from Mrs. Collins, finding unexpected satisfaction in creating something beautiful with her hands. Now, the joy of selecting fabric for a new project evaporated, replaced by the bitter reality of how the town viewed her position. She paid for her purchases with composed dignity, but her hands trembled as she exited the store. Standing on the boardwalk, blinking back tears, she nearly collided with Maxwell himself, who had just emerged from the bank across the street. "Miss Sullivan," he greeted her, then stopped, studying her face. "What's happened?" The genuine concern in his voice broke something inside her. "Nothing that wasn't entirely predictable," she replied, her voice unsteady. "I've simply been reminded of my status in this arrangement." Understanding darkened his expression. "Come," he said quietly, offering his arm. "Let's walk." Reluctantly, she placed her hand on his sleeve, acutely aware of the curious gazes following them down Main Street. Maxwell led her to a small park behind the courthouse, where a bench sat beneath a cottonwood tree. "When I first came to White Ridge 15 years ago," he began once they were seated, "I was considered an interloper. Eastern money, Eastern education. Not to be trusted. There were rumors I'd fled Boston after murdering my business partner. He smiled faintly at Eleanor's startled expression. People fear what they don't understand, and they fill in the gaps with their own imaginings. It's different for you, Eleanor argued. You're a man of means. Your position commands respect regardless of gossip. Maxwell nodded thoughtfully. True enough, but respect built on fear or financial dependency is hollow. The respect worth having must be earned. He turned slightly to face her. Give it time, Eleanor. Allow them to see you as I do. It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the way he said it made her heart skip. And how do you see me, Mr. Harrington? She asked softly. His gray eyes held hers steadily. As a woman of substance, intelligent, compassionate, stronger than you realize. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by birdsong and distant sounds from the street. Eleanor found herself studying his profile, the strong jaw, the lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more in private than in public. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly consider a future at his side. The town's annual Founders' Day celebration arrived in early June, marking the halfway point of their 3-month agreement. Eleanor attended on Maxwell's arm, wearing a new dress of deep blue silk that Mrs. Collins had helped her make. The event was held in the town square, with tables laden with food, a band playing on the gazebo, and lanterns strung between trees. As Maxwell's presumed fiancée, Eleanor found herself the center of attention, introduced to business associates from neighboring towns, included in conversations with the mayor and town council, pulled aside for confidential chats by the wives of prominent citizens. Many seemed surprised by her articulate responses and knowledge of current events, gleaned from the newspapers Maxwell brought home daily. Mrs. Fletcher from the lending library whispered, "He's different since you came, my dear, less stern. He actually laughed at the council meeting last week, nearly gave Judge Wilson apoplexy." As twilight deepened, Maxwell led Eleanor to the dance floor, established on the packed earth of the square. "I should warn you," she said nervously, "I've never had formal dancing lessons." He smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "Fortunately, I have. Just follow my lead." His hand at her waist was warm and steady as he guided her through a waltz, then a lively reel. Eleanor found herself laughing as they turned beneath the lanterns, momentarily free of worry about appearances and expectations. When a slower tune began, Maxwell drew her slightly closer, their movements more intimate. "You're the talk of the evening," he murmured near her ear. "Every man here envies me." Eleanor's pulse quickened at the warmth in his voice. "Because you own half the town?" she teased gently. His expression grew serious. "Because I have the privilege of your company, Eleanor Sullivan. A privilege I've come to value more than I anticipated." The gathering storm finally broke late that night, rain drumming against the mansion's roof as Eleanor prepared for bed. A knock at her sitting room door revealed Maxwell, still dressed, though he had removed his jacket and tie. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, "but I wanted to ensure your window was secure against the storm." Before Eleanor could respond, a blinding flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that rattled the window panes. She gasped, instinctively stepping backward. Maxwell moved to the window, securing the latch and drawing the curtains. Another thunderclap shook the house, and Eleanor jumped, embarrassed by her reaction. "The storms were always worse at the ranch," she explained. "The house would shake so badly we feared it might collapse." Understanding softened his expression. He gestured to the small fireplace. "May I?" At her nod, he knelt to light the kindling already laid there, the domestic task seeming incongruous performed by a man of his stature. As warmth from the fire gradually filled the room, Eleanor's tension eased. Maxwell remained standing, maintaining a proper distance, yet his presence was oddly comforting rather than intrusive. "Thank you for accompanying me this evening," he said. "You were magnificent. Half the council is now convinced you should chair the Education Committee." Eleanor smiled despite herself. "Hardly, though I do have thoughts about expanding the lending library." Something shifted in Maxwell's expression, a softening, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "1 month remains of our agreement, Eleanor. I find myself—" He paused, choosing his words carefully, "increasingly hopeful about your decision." The thunder rumbled again, more distant now. Eleanor took a deep breath, suddenly aware they were approaching a precipice of another kind. "I've been thinking about my decision a great deal," she admitted. "It's not as clear-cut as it once seemed." Maxwell stepped closer, his gaze intent. "May I ask what has changed?" Eleanor hesitated, examining her own confused emotions. "When I came here, I saw only the transaction, my freedom exchanged for my brother's security. I resented them. I resented you." He nodded, accepting her honesty without offense. "And now?" She met his gaze directly. "Now I see a man who treats his employees fairly, who established a school fund for children who can't afford supplies, who remembers Mrs. Collins' birthday and asks after her grandson in the cavalry, who notices what books I enjoy and makes sure I have access to more." She took a shaky breath. A man who might, in time, be more than merely tolerable as a husband. Maxwell's expression remained carefully controlled, but she saw the flash of hope in his eyes. "I will not rush your decision," he said quietly. "Take the full month, Eleanor. Be certain, a lifetime is a long commitment to make from a sense of obligation alone." The following week brought another visitor to the Harrington mansion. Thomas Sullivan, hat in hand, shifting uncomfortably in the formal parlor. Eleanor received him alone, her greeting cool but civil. "The ranch is doing well," he reported. "Robert's using some of the capital Mr. Harrington provided to dig a new well closer to the south pasture." He studied his sister, noting her changed appearance, the finer clothes, the more elegant hairstyle, the subtle confidence in her posture. "You look well, Ellie. Town life agrees with you." Eleanor arched an eyebrow. "Did you come to ensure your investment is being properly maintained, Thomas?" He flinched at her words. "I deserve that. But no, I came because," he swallowed hard, "because I wanted to apologize. What we did, what I did, was unforgivable, using you to solve our problems." His voice cracked slightly. "Mother would have been ashamed of me." The genuine remorse in her brother's expression softened Eleanor's resentment. "It was wrong," she agreed quietly. "I felt betrayed by the two people I trusted most in the world." Thomas nodded miserably. "I've thought of little else these past weeks. Robert too, though he'd never admit it." He leaned forward earnestly. "If you want to come home, Ellie, say the word. We'll figure something out, even if it means selling part of the ranch." Eleanor was touched by the offer, recognizing the significance of Thomas suggesting they part with their father's land. "Thank you," she said sincerely, "but I'm not certain the ranch is my home anymore." Thomas studied her face. "Harrington, he treats you well?" Eleanor nodded. "Better than I expected. Better than I deserve, perhaps, given my initial hostility." Her brother looked relieved. "He's a good man, Ellie. I've always known that, even when I was using his interest in you to our advantage. Doesn't excuse what we did, but at least we didn't deliver you to a monster. After Thomas departed, Eleanor sought out Maxwell in his study, a book-lined room where he handled correspondence each afternoon. He looked up in surprise at her knock, immediately rising from his desk. "Is everything all right? I saw your brother arrive." Eleanor entered, closing the door partially behind her. Improper, perhaps, but she needed privacy for this conversation. "I've made my decision," she said without preamble. Maxwell went very still, his expression guarded. "I see. You've had sufficient time to consider?" Eleanor nodded, moving closer. "I have. My brother came to apologize, to offer me a way out if I wanted it." Maxwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And do you want a way out?" His voice was carefully neutral, betraying nothing of his own feelings. Eleanor took a deep breath. "No, I don't." The tension in his shoulders eased slightly, but his expression remained cautious. "May I ask why?" "Because somewhere between resentment and resignation, I discovered something unexpected," Eleanor said softly. "I discovered a man worth knowing, a man I could respect. Perhaps even, in time, a man I could love." Color rose in her cheeks at this admission, but she continued steadily. "You offered me a partnership. I'd like to accept, not out of obligation, but from choice." Maxwell moved toward her slowly, as if approaching a wild creature that might bolt. "Eleanor," he said, her name a caress on his lips. "Are you certain? I would not bind you to me without your full consent." She nodded, surprising herself with the depth of her conviction. "I'm certain. The circumstances that brought us together were far from ideal. But what we've built these past 2 months feels real, feels right." He took her hands in his touch gentle yet sure. "Then, Eleanor Sullivan, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not as part of our previous arrangement, but as a new beginning between us?" The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the town's small church, attended by a curious mixture of White Ridge's prominent citizens and the working people of the community. Eleanor wore a gown of ivory satin that she and Mrs. Collins had labored over, her hair adorned with fresh wildflowers, rather than an elaborate veil. Thomas and Robert stood awkwardly in new suits, their presence both a painful reminder of how this journey began and a hopeful sign of reconciliation. Maxwell waited at the altar, looking uncharacteristically nervous, his usually perfect composure slightly shaken as Eleanor walked toward him on Thomas's arm. When she reached him, he took her hands in his eyes conveying what words could not: gratitude, admiration, and something deeper that made Eleanor's heart race. As they exchanged their vows, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here. From a woman traded like cattle, to a woman choosing her own path, her own partner, her own future. The reception was held in the Harrington Mansion's gardens, now in full summer bloom. Eleanor moved among the guests with newfound confidence, no longer the outsider, but the mistress of the house and her own destiny. Mrs. Fletcher clasped her hands warmly. "My dear, you've done the impossible. You've humanized our Mr. Harrington. The whole town is abuzz with the transformation." Eleanor smiled, watching her husband, across the lawn, deep in conversation with the schoolteacher about expanding the building. "Perhaps we've transformed each other," she replied thoughtfully. Later, as musicians played and couples danced on a wooden platform erected for the occasion, Maxwell led her away from the festivities to a quiet corner of the garden. "Happy, Mrs. Harrington?" he asked, a hint of vulnerability in his question. Eleanor reached up to touch his face gently. "Happier than I ever imagined possible when I stood on my brother's porch and watched you arrive that first evening." As the celebration wound down and the last guests departed, Eleanor and Maxwell stood together on the mansion's wide front porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. His arm around her waist was no longer a foreign presence, but a welcome anchor in her new life. "You know, there will be talk for years about how Maxwell Harrington bought himself a bride," she mused, leaning against his shoulder. He chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Let them talk. We know the truth." Eleanor turned in his embrace to face him. "And what is the truth, Mr. Harrington?" His expression grew serious as he gazed down at her. "That what began as a transaction became something neither of us expected. That the woman who was once given away like cattle now owns not just half the town." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face with tender fingers. "But the heart of the man who owns it." The Montana sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples as Maxwell and Eleanor Harrington stood on the hill overlooking White Ridge. 6 months had passed since their wedding day, the town now preparing for winter as the first crisp breezes signaled the changing season. Eleanor's hand rested comfortably in the crook of her husband's arm, her gold wedding band catching the fading light. "I received a letter from Thomas today," she said. "The new breeding stock is thriving. He thinks next spring's calves will be the best yet." Maxwell nodded with satisfaction. "Your brothers have proven more capable ranchers than I initially gave them credit for. They simply needed the right opportunity." Eleanor smiled, thinking of how far they had all come from those desperate days when her brothers had seen her as their only asset worth trading. "And what of your opportunities, Mrs. Harrington?" Maxwell asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "Any regrets about your choice?" Eleanor turned to face her husband, studying the face that had become so dear to her. "Only that I resisted for so long," she answered honestly. "We could have had these months of happiness sooner if I hadn't been so stubborn." Maxwell laughed, drawing her closer. "Your stubbornness is one of your finest qualities, my love. It's what makes you Eleanor rather than merely Mrs. Harrington." His expression grew more serious. "You've done remarkable things these past months. The school committee sings your praises, and Mrs. Fletcher tells me the new library extension wouldn't exist without your fundraising efforts." Eleanor flushed with pleasure at his words. What had begun as small projects to occupy her time had grown into genuine passions. Improving education for White Ridge's children, ensuring books were available to all residents, regardless of means, establishing a women's aid society to assist those in difficult circumstances. As they turned to walk back toward their home, now truly theirs in spirit as well as name, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them together, from a woman treated like property to a respected partner, from resentment to love, from constraint to choice. The town that had once whispered about her behind their hands now sought her counsel and support. The man who had once seemed a distant, intimidating figure had revealed himself as thoughtful, principled, and ultimately deeply loving. The brothers who had betrayed her trust were slowly earning redemption through changed behavior rather than mere words. And she herself had discovered strengths she hadn't known she possessed. The sun dipped below the horizon as they reached the mansion's gates, its last rays gilding Maxwell's silver-touched hair. "What are you thinking?" he asked, noticing her contemplative smile. Eleanor squeezed his hand. That sometimes the most unexpected beginnings can lead to the most beautiful journeys. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.